Crowe and Meg Ryan star in Proof of Life, our big film in an hour. First, a life cut short but lived to the full. The Queen's Lost Uncle on 4.
At the height of the Second World War, in August 1942, a very special passenger boarded a flying boat in northern Scotland. He was a high-ranking member of the royal family, whose outrageous private life had been a source of damaging rumour and scandal. Now he was on a secret mission. Flying conditions on the day were near perfect. An experienced crew was at the controls. But minutes into the flight, the aircraft crashed into a mountainside and exploded. Prince George, Duke of Kent, the present Queen's controversial uncle, was dead. This is the true story behind one of the royal family's best-kept secrets. Prince George, black sheep of the House of Windsor. The facts behind George's life and mysterious death are so disturbing that to this day all of his papers remain under lock and key. And it's not hard to see why. If the 1920s and 30s had a royal bad boy, George was it. With devastating good looks and the charm to match, he danced his way through a whirl of hard drugs and casual sex, with both women and men. But he was also a man of high artistic promise, and was to make a fairy tale marriage to a beautiful princess. Above all, he was desperate to find his way to a meaningful role in life. And he finally died in pursuit of it. Prince George was born in 1902. He was the fourth son of the future King George V and Queen Mary.
Well, King George V was the ultimate conformist. He was trying desperately to make the family seem perfect. He had to drill into all his children the idea of duty, and he was utterly ruthless in that way. My father made me scared, and I will make them scared.
The King's oldest sons, Edward, Bertie and Henry, were groomed to shoulder the responsibilities of royal tradition. But for young Georgie, the future was uncertain.
I think by the time it got to George, who was 8 years younger than his oldest brother, King George V had his eye on empire, not on parenthood, and he was allowed to spend more time with the nanny and develop his own tastes and characteristics, which made him, you might say, a bit more effeminate, but certainly more cultured and a warmer individual.
You really did have Prince George, Duke of Kent, who was the outstanding child, in many ways the most gifted. Of the four brothers, Edward, the heir to the throne, was pretty much a Philistine. Bertie, who became George VI, was not a particularly cultured or artistic individual. Henry, who became Duke of Gloucester, was practically bovine, not remotely academic. So you'd got Prince George, who was the exception to the rule in that family.
He was the jaunty one, the one with a slightly cocksure sense of humour, who would tease his father. And this was very unlike the rather scared Bertie, who became king, and also the rather peacocky elder brother, Edward. George could get away with it. The others either fell in line or were a bit too nervous.
A fifth son, Prince John, was born with learning disabilities. He was shunned by most of his family, but not by George.
It was clear there was something not quite right with him. He was obviously backward in his learning, and after a while was sent away with a nanny and in the end locked away because they couldn't deal with a child like John at all. George, on the other hand, he never gave up on his friends. He went on seeing him, went on looking after him. When Prince John died, Prince George was terribly sad and very hurt.
Unlike the older brothers, George excelled in the classroom. Encouraged by his mother, he became fluent in 5 languages. But the language he loved most of all was music.
I think he was doted on by his mother. You know, maybe she loved him the best because he was the easiest to love. And maybe he was the easiest to love partly because he was more sensitive and liked playing the piano and looking at pretty things. And maybe it came that way round.
But the royal parents found it difficult to express their affection. And George's father showed little appreciation of his son's obvious talent.
George had absolutely nothing in common with his father. His father was a man of little learning. What he wanted was conformists. He wanted young boys in uniform who were going to salute him and do exactly what they were told.
For George, there was to be no escape from family tradition. He was dispatched to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. For the sensitive and brilliant 14-year-old, it could hardly have been a worse choice.
He hated it. He hated being in the Navy. He just knew he didn't want to do it. And in a sense, that's rather cruel to make somebody do it. And interesting enough, when he went to school, he did incredibly well, was much the cleverest. When he got to Dartmouth, he passed out second bottom of the class. Well, there was no reason for him to do that. He was trying to do it on purpose. You know, I'll do it badly on purpose, so I'm not made to go on doing it.
Despite the king's best efforts to turn his son into a sailor, there was one problem no amount of training could resolve. George was chronically seasick.
It must have been a nightmare for George. Duty, duty, duty was the call of the day. His father, who was obsessed by the Navy and who would be able to roll at the tip of his tongue every rank, every rule, every permutation of dress. And here was George, who was, you know, a young guy cut off from what he wanted to do. And he wrote to my grandfather, just saying, you know, I'm going crazy here.
I've tried to make the king see that I'm not cut out for the Navy, but it's no use. What can I do? It would be marvelous if you could say something about my not going back, as I hate it so much. I feel I'll go mad before long. I feel so cut off, and the people are terribly boring. Anyway, I have indigestion, so I can get Dr. Weir to say I can't possibly go back.
The spoilt child in him was coming out. He wanted to get away, he wanted to play. He saw his elder brother, 8 years older, having a wonderful time in London, mixing with a very fast set, very sexy girls. George was ready for that. He didn't want to wait until he was 28 or 29. He wanted to have all that now. Duty, well, he wasn't very interested in wearing a uniform.
For a young man like George, there was only one place to be in the Roaring Twenties. Post-war London was alive with new music and fashion.
And the absolute religion was dancing. If you had 3 people round in the evening, it was, shall we roll back the carpet, let's turn the gramophone on, and let's dance.
He was mixing with a new age, the jazz age. George, with this inquiring mind, this unprincely inquiring mind, was reaching out into this fabulous new world which he'd discovered in London, full of artists and writers and people in show business who could give him all the stuff that he wasn't getting at home.
The King's artistic young son was an instant hit in London's high society.
He obviously had absolute monumental amounts of charm. And he had that obviously attractive thing of very blue eyes and dark hair. He made people laugh, he played the piano, you know, he sang, he mimicked people. All that stuff, he was good fun. Plus, I'm sorry, you know, he was a prince.
In 1922, during one of his frequent leaves of absence from the Navy on medical grounds, George was introduced to the glamorous debutante, Lady Alexandra Curzon, known to her friends as Baba.
He was very, very handsome. We had a great deal of fun. There were so many wonderful parties being given all over London. So you went to 2 or 3 parties tonight, and everybody was superbly dressed in the most lovely clothes with all their jewels on, and you danced away till 4 o'clock in the morning.
Prince George was very much in love with Baba. She was very beautiful. She was the sort of debutante of her year. She had a wonderful slim figure. She was immensely chic. And being the youngest daughter of the Marquis of Curzon, she was right at the heart of the beau monde of society.
I taught Prince George to drive. It was very frightening because at the moment when we were just changing seats, an enormous Daimler rolled past and Queen Mary was in it. So we only hoped that Queen Mary hadn't recognized her son, because he was supposed to have been at Dartmouth. He was a great personal friend of mine. I was very fond of him.
But George's feelings ran even deeper. On his return to sea, he bombarded Baba with love letters.
Baba, dear, here is the bag I promised, but you will probably think it is too awful. If so, let me know and I'll try to get another. I did so enjoy Saturday, though your nerves must have been terribly shaken from my driving. I hope so much to see you again soon. You are so sweet to me. Please don't forget the photo, will you? Much love, G.
George was infatuated, but his illusions were soon to be crushed. In 1925, while he was away serving in the Far East, Baba married dashing cavalry officer Fruity Metcalfe. George was devastated, but Baba wouldn't be the last woman to break his heart. Jilted by Baba Metcalfe, and with his naval career in free fall, Prince George sought refuge in the heady world of London's 1920s party scene. George's partner in crime, his favourite older brother and kindred spirit, Edward, Prince of Wales.
They both had in common this wild streak, the self-indulgent streak, the getting back at Dad for making me do something I don't want to do streak. They liked kind of loose women and drinking too much, and it made it easier that there were 2 of them doing it.
There is that marvellous story of the jazz musician Tiny Winters, seeing them leaving the Embassy Club in the West End of London about 3 o'clock one morning and chasing one another down the street, kicking their top hats and shoving them on lampposts and just generally acting like lads about town.
George looked up to Edward, and they would go out on the town together, and it would not be reported in the gossip columns. Anything you wanted to do, you could, and they did.
Egged on by Edward, George was now able to indulge his passion for music, theatre and dancing. During a jaunt to the south of France in 1926, George even entered a tango competition under an assumed identity, and won.
Mr. Chairman, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, I need hardly say how glad I am to be here today.
The day job was rather less glamorous.
I have much pleasure in declaring open the Antique Dealers' Fair and Exhibition.
George may have been an A-list celebrity on the nightclub circuit, but by day he was trapped in a cycle of strictly B-list royal engagements.
No one at that time did they have any idea what they were going to do with Prince George. They'd got an heir, they got a spare to the spare. By the time they got to Prince George, they had absolutely no idea what they could possibly do with him. He was left ready pretty much to do what he wanted to do.
In public, George put a brave face on the round of minor ceremonial duties imposed upon him by the king. But behind the scenes, he was drifting into dangerous waters.
Pretty soon he learned what the rules were, which was that you could make love to any woman who was never going to threaten your career. Now, those could be married women, they could be foreigners, or, most importantly, they could be people from show business.
George's name was linked with a succession of beauties from the stage and screen. amongst them the jazz singer Florence Mills and the silent movie star Lois Sturt.
Wherever he turned, there was another girl. He liked actresses very much. Gloria Swanson, Tallulah Bankhead. There are a number of others that came across his path, and people were only too ready to throw themselves at his feet, and he was ready for them to do it.
But there was one girl who would become far more than just another one of George's passing fancies. In 1927, he fell deeply in love with and proposed to the wealthy banking heiress Helen Poppy Baring.
It was clearly, a great love of his life. And the king thought they just weren't particularly suitable in probably snobbish terms. She wasn't grand enough. The king would have had to be involved and would have had to give him his permission. It really did become more than just an affair of the heart. It became almost an affair of state.
I wrote to the king saying I couldn't take his no as final, and he answered that he could never change his decision. The only reason he could give was that he didn't think it suitable, which is very weak. I think he was trying to frighten me off, but he hasn't succeeded. I can't see how they can possibly stop it. They must know I'm serious and not likely to change my mind. In fact, it works more the other way.
And George felt very strongly, and, he was clearly loved her, and he wrote this impassioned letter. But in the end, it clearly was to no avail, as the marriage did not take place.
Once again, George's desires had been thwarted by his father. George sank into a deep depression.
By this stage, the Royal Navy were very happy to see the back of him. He was going nowhere and nowhere fast. He didn't turn up for work quite a lot of the time, and there was a realization all round in the Royal Court that something had to be done about it.
The palace's solution was to pack George off to North America on his first official royal tour. But for his chaperone, they couldn't have picked a worse companion. George's old drinking pal and heir to the throne, Edward.
It's quite perplexing why they were sent off together. Given, too, they were quite a volatile and dangerous couple in some ways. And there were a few incidents, such as everybody turning up for some function at Government House and arriving to see the two princes in squash clothes going off to play squash. And the whole company had to wait while they had a game of squash, came back, bath, changed for dinner and came down. Not really on. When you're representing the King and Queen, it's really quite shoddy. They both kept bad time, they both did a bit what they wanted. George turned up once, so drunk he could hardly stand.
The king's attempt to banish George's playboy image had fallen flat on its face. But the king's advisors now brought him even worse news. At the age of 21, George had attended the opening night of a West End show by the sensational young playwright Noel Coward. George was captivated, and after the performance, he asked to be shown to the stage door.
I met him at a party just a couple of years ago.
Gertrude Lawrence came back to her dressing room after a performance to find the young Prince George trying on one of her wigs. Probably a bit of a shock for her, but something that obviously he adored. This was something that he was rather fond of, or at least he had a strong inclination for.
But like a silly fool.
A bemused Gertrude Lawrence introduced George to the show's writer and star, Noel Coward. As Coward later recalled, it was to be the start of a passionate affair.
I think this is probably when George became aware of his bisexuality. Noel Coward was the first of his male lovers. Coward spoke about it himself. This was something that he was very proud of.
On the silver screen, he melts my foolish heart in every single scene.
The Prince George Noel Coward relationship was a love relationship. Certainly, from Noel Coward's point of view, a very genuine love there, and tremendous affection, I would have thought, on the part of Prince George. there is this marvellous story of a policeman spotting two rather colourful females clacking their way on high heels down a West End street one evening, only to discover that these two highly bewigged and highly made-up individuals were none other than Noel Coward and Prince George. They could get away with that sort of thing then.
I'm so ashamed of it, but must admit the sleepless night.
It was said of George at the time that he was not a person who would be safe in a taxi with anybody of either sex. So that while there were a lot of young men who would pounce on any young woman they were in a taxi with, he would also pounce on any man. He was promiscuous. He was bisexually promiscuous at a stage in his life.
It wasn't so remarkable that he should be interested in men, except that, of course, it was illegal in those days. And the danger to the state, as perceived by King George, the man, the ultimate conformist, was terrifying.
By the late 1920s, George's behaviour was becoming more than just a private embarrassment. He'd begun to leave a glaring trail of compromising evidence in his wake.
On one occasion, King George V felt it necessary to send two emissaries to Paris. They burgled an apartment and took from it a gold box with an inscription to a man with George's name underneath it, together with a number of letters which were either returned to Buckingham Palace or destroyed. And there were one or two incidents like this where George sailed very close to the wind. As time went on, the stakes of the game were upped, and there would be drug taking, there'd be more drinking, there would be more extreme behaviour. George had decided on the course that he was going to take.
At the end of 1928, hard on the heels of their ill-mannered tour of the Americas, Prince George and his older brother paid a private visit to Kenya. They were there to spend time with a group of Edward's friends, an exclusive clique of British settlers in the area north of Nairobi. It was known as the Happy Valley. For George, it was to be anything but.
Kiki Preston lived with the Happy Valley set, and there were no rules at all. You could have what you wanted and who you wanted on demand, and they did. And she finally was introduced to Prince George at a time when his career was going up and down. He was not really quite sure where he was going. She was a very forceful personality, and she was called the Lady with the Silver Syringe.
George had done it again. He'd fallen for yet another unsuitable woman. Kiki Preston was Happy Valley's resident drug addict. George was spellbound. After a few weeks together, he'd got himself a serious morphine habit.
George's addiction to drink and drugs at different times was really the result of a deep-seated unhappiness which came from his childhood. He was more accomplished than his brothers, and yet he lived in this royal vacuum where there was nothing for him to do, no expectations. There was something missing in his life, an inner lack. He had no job, he had no career path that he could cling to. It's a very sad state of affairs.
George returned to England a full-blown drug addict. And in the summer of 1929, Edward decided enough was enough.
Edward behaved very well at this point, and possibly for the only time in his whole life thought about somebody more than himself. And he took George down to his house in the country.
You know, the royal family are very good at closing their eyes to what they don't want to see. And Edward had to keep his wide open in looking out for a brother who was incredibly wayward.
Imprisoned by his brother at a secluded country retreat, George was forced to confront his addiction and submit to a painful program of rehabilitation.
I think that is definitely an indication of the bond that existed between those two brothers. But Edward was the only one that could have done it.
The cure has reached a rather tricky stage, and it may be that I'm needed this weekend. I'm carrying out the work of a doctor, jailer, and detective combined. The old saying, boys will be boys, is all right, until you get too old and should know the form better. He seems to lack all sense of knowing what is so obviously the wrong thing to do.
All through the winter of '29, Edward dragged George back from his slide into oblivion. But for Kiki Preston, there would be no happy ending.
Kiki Whitney Preston committed suicide in Claridge's Hotel in Mayfair, and she took her silver syringe and gave herself a very large overdose. The police completely covered up this suicide. There's no record of the hotel having had a death at that time. There was no funeral that anybody knows about, and certainly Prince George, who had lived with Kiki Whitney Preston and had learned so much from her about the Lucia side of life, never even acknowledged her passing.
Prince George is looking bronzed and fit as he comes down the gangway to receive a great welcome.
King George V had been deeply shocked by his son's drug addiction. Now, after years of intransigence, he finally relented. George could leave the Navy. It was the chance of a fresh start, but there was to be no question of a career in his beloved world of theatre and the arts. George's new job? A Home Office factory inspector.
A more glamorous prince you could not wish to meet. A less glamorous job you could not wish to have. It was really almost a rap on the knuckles by the king for having done such a bad job so far.
I think he did throw himself into it. He insisted on going through the full training that everybody else went through. He insisted on doing it properly. And he had this side of him that would apply himself. He applied himself to pleasure, but he also applied himself to work. And if it meant looking unromantic in a bowler hat, I don't think he really minded that. And he could start thinking, I'm a proper person. There is a point.
The new job not only gave George a purpose in life, it turned out to be a PR masterstroke. With working conditions and social justice the talk of the day, the public loved seeing George get his hands dirty. The press dubbed him the Democratic Duke. On stage at last, George could now bask in the adulation of the public gallery.
When he met people face to face, they instantly adored him. He had the glamour, he had the touch, he had the feel. He was sensitive enough to know how to reach out and shake a hand and look someone in the eye and make them feel special.
By his 30th birthday, George's transformation into a respectable royal was almost complete. But there remained one small question mark that needed clearing up.
Doesn't matter what a man's proclivities are, provided he conceals them beneath the respectable veneer of marriage. And I think with George's extremely colourful private life that was never going to go away, what they had to do was to get this man married.
The princes certainly are having a busy time during their visit to Sweden. One can't help noticing, as our pictures clearly show, that Prince George and Princess Ingrid seem very happy together. And we're all thrilled to even the suggestion of a royal romance.
On a state visit to Scandinavia in 1932, Princess Ingrid of Sweden was lined up as the palace's favoured candidate. But as usual, George had other ideas. In 1933, he was introduced by one of his own friends to a penniless Greek princess, now living in exile in Paris.
Not exactly arranged, but there was a limited choice of people they could marry. And if a beautiful young woman happened to be in that slot, you probably thought, oh, good. And Princess Marina, after all, was very beautiful, very intelligent, very cultured. And Prince George loved beauty. And he realized, this is the girl for me.
In August 1934, Marina was holidaying with relatives in Yugoslavia when the family received a surprise telephone call.
He rung up and said, I'm coming to stay. At which point they, the parents of Marina, rung up and said, quick, come, I think he's coming to see her. But George was so determined to go, he borrowed an aeroplane off his brother and just flew to Yugoslavia. Anyone that says it was an arranged marriage, it's just wrong. He was capable of these wonderful flights of this great romantic gesture.
I think he must have been so excited. I'm amazed he managed to land his tiger moth. His hands must have been shaking. Imagine flying yourself that far in those rickety old aeroplanes, knowing that you're not only in love with this girl, you're also in love with the idea of being in love with this girl. It was just all so perfect. You were longing to sock it to your family that you'd find somebody completely unusual, not somebody that had been found for you, not somebody that somebody from Debrecen had decided was perfect, but somebody he'd met through his own circle of friends, through his own world, and who happened to be ideal. It must have been heady stuff, and bully for him.
Out of this aeroplane steps this handsome prince in the middle of a garden party where all these people were standing around, and you know, it's like any good film would end there. The music and the flowers, and now a few days later they were engaged.
We have received so many congratulations. We want to thank everyone for all their kindness to us.
I'm so very happy and looking forward to come to England.
The Channel steamer Canterbury steams in out of the fog and comes alongside at Dover. On board is Princess Marina, standing between her parents.
In September 1934, Marina arrived in England to prepare for the royal wedding. For a nervous George, it was a chance to show off his future wife in public for the first time.
Princess Marina is seen radiant and vivacious, receiving from her fiancé's relations a right royal welcome to Britain.
George needn't have worried. Marina was an overnight sensation.
I'm so happy I can hardly believe it. Everyone here is so delighted with Marina, the crowd especially. When she arrived, they expected a dowdy princess, such as unfortunately my family are. But when they saw this lovely chic creature, they could hardly believe it. Even the men shouted, "Don't let them change you." Of course she won't be changed. Not if I have anything to do with it.
Boys from Eton used to send off sixpence to have a poster of her on their wall, and she instantly became a kind of fashion icon. And they were the glamorous couple that people wanted to have to dinner. Oh, we've got the Kents coming.
Here was Prince George, this matinee idol, devilishly good-looking and suave and debonair, and here was Marina, who, like him, was tall and elegant and very sophisticated and very cosmopolitan, extremely cultured. Of course, the British public went bananas.
Troublesome young George was finally hitched. And at the couple's swanky villa in London's Belgrave Square, George threw himself into the refined art of homemaking.
I mean, Marina had very little to do when she was first married, because all the traditional stuff the wife would have done were completely taken away by George. George organised the soft furnishings, he organised the flowers, he organised the food.
When they were having dinner parties, George would choose the porcelain, the china, the menus. It was George, it was not Marina.
Less than a year after their wedding, the first of 3 children, Prince Edward, was born. 2 more were to follow, Princess Alexandra and Prince Michael. The wild prince had been domesticated.
George did find a great measure of happiness. I think that's what he wanted. He wanted a home, he wanted a family. I think he'd been isolated in childhood, he'd been isolated for most of his adult life, and I think what he wanted more than anything else was the closeness of family.
But even as he relaxed within the bosom of his new family, George's best friend and elder brother Edward was about to plunge the House of Windsor into the most serious crisis in its history.
Shortly after midnight, the world heard the broadcast announcement. Death has come peacefully to the king at 11:55.
1936, which began with the death of their father, George V, was to become the year of 3 kings.
You all know the reasons which have impelled me to renounce the throne. But you must believe me that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love.
On the 12th of December 1936, George's beloved brother Edward abandoned his throne and plunged the family into turmoil.
The abdication of Edward had the most tremendous impact on Prince George. He couldn't believe that this older brother that he absolutely adored was throwing up his birthright in order to marry Mrs. Simpson. And in fact, when Edward came back to Royal Lodge, where members of the royal family had been having dinner, having made the abdication broadcast from Windsor Castle, and was about to get into his car to drive off to Portsmouth and to exile, Prince George is known to have cried out, "This isn't happening."
Edward and his hated bride Wallis Simpson were now banished to France. As their scandalous wedding drew closer, an ancient pact between George and Edward now hung in the balance. Ever since their wild days, George had solemnly promised to serve as best man when his older brother found a wife. Now, George faced a terrible dilemma.
There was no way that any member of the royal family was going to be at that wedding. Absolutely no way. It would have been tantamount of condoning it, of giving their approval.
George's choice: defy his family or betray his best friend. It was to be one of the most difficult decisions he would ever make.
I think he did expect him to come, yes. I mean, he hoped he would come. When he found out he wouldn't come, if you say that it damaged the relationship between the brothers, it eventually, of course, did. I mean, the relationship between the Duke of Windsor and his brothers, of course, was damaged by that. I think he did never really forgive him.
For his best man, a devastated Edward now turned to George's old rival in love, Fruity Metcalfe. And George's wedding gift, a jewelled Fabergé box, was returned, accompanied by a terse note.
The only box I have come to expect from my brother is a box on the ears.
The friendship between George and Edward was over. The urgent question now was, who would replace him as king? As Edward had abdicated and not died, in theory any one of his brothers could now ascend the throne, including George.
George felt nothing but sorrow and pity for his brother. At the same time, there was ambition, because it was pretty much thought that the Duke of York was a very poor choice as a substitute king. There was absolutely no question Prince Harry, the Duke of Gloucester, a drunken buffoon, could not possibly have sat on the throne. He would have fallen off. And there was quite a lot of talk at that time that Prince George would have filled his eldest brother's shoes. I think the public would have loved it if George had become king. They would have grasped him with great warmth.
But it was not to be. Finally, it was decided that George's second brother, the stammering Bertie, would have to take on the responsibility of kingship. The new monarch's first challenge was to come to terms with the worsening political situation in Europe. The rise of Nazism had placed his family in a delicate situation. Their name had been Saxe-Coburg-Gotha until changed to Windsor in 1917. They had more relatives in Germany than in Britain, and the prospect of war with their German cousins was appalling.
The Duke and Duchess of Kent pay a visit to Countess Thüring, the Duchess's sister, in Munich.
Now, for the first time in his life, George's family needed him.
King George VI paid very close attention to the changing politics in Europe in the 1930s, and he relied very much on George to keep him advised. And when he went to Germany with his wife Marina, these were not just simply social visits to Germany. He was actually going there intentionally to learn all he could about this powerful new political body in Europe.
Using Marina's German relations as cover, George set out on a series of fact-finding missions to help his family evaluate the Nazi threat.
As the youngest of the Windsor brothers, he had a certain degree of anonymity, and so he was in a position where he could chat with top Nazis, receive briefings, and generally ask questions that the King of England could not do.
He was beginning to feel there was something that he could do, that he wasn't just a spare prince, you know, the heir and the spare plus a few. He wasn't just that. He was, if you like, up there with the big boys. He was proving himself. Then the war came along, and then it was taken from him. It's very cruel.
War with Germany changed everything. The new job was put on hold. George was back in limbo.
I have been to the Admiralty. Awful waste of time. So I went to see Chamberlain and asked him if he could find me something I could do which, being what I am, would be really useful to the country. You see, we are used for anything and everything in peace, but when war comes, no one wants us.
With the nation facing its darkest hour, George was now desperate to play his part. But back in the dreaded uniform, his contribution to the war effort was restricted to bomb site inspections and charity appeals.
As a member of the Royal Air Force, I know of the urgent necessity of assisting those who are injured and the dependence of those who have given their lives for their country.
Well, I think he was supposed to be improving the nation's morale, but at the same time his own morale was ebbing away. I think the emptiness of his existence was almost too much to bear. He was given menial tasks, and he once again took to the bottle. And I know of at least one occasion when he turned up to meet members of the public and serving war workers, drunk in the morning. And that really was pretty unforgivable.
George was sinking fast. But in April 1941, he was to play a central role in one of the most extraordinary episodes of the Second World War. In the spring of '41, a German invasion of Britain still seemed likely. But the men of British intelligence had a diversionary plan. Their aim was to fool the Nazis into believing that rebel British MPs and members of the royal family were preparing to take power in London and sue for peace with Germany. If the plan succeeded, then Nazi aggression would be turned away from Britain towards Hitler's next target, the Soviet Union. And recently discovered Foreign Office documents reveal that Prince George was to be the bait.
Because of his many close relatives who are currently working for the regime in Germany, British intelligence perceived that Prince George would be a character readily believed as a man of Nazi sympathies, and here was a man that the Nazis would recognize from their dealings of only a few years before. He acted as the close man.
George had showed considerable courage. If things went wrong, he might be labeled as a pro-German appeaser. The astute prince ensured that an official record of the plan and his role in it was placed in the archives. On the night of the 10th of May 1941, at a secluded country house in Scotland, George sat and waited. He was listening for the engines of the small aircraft that would bring him face to face with Hitler's negotiator.
On that one night of the year hinged the prospect of defeat for Britain. They had to persuade this top Nazi that they were negotiating for real, and that Churchill would soon be ousted from power, and that Hitler would have his peace deal with the British government.
But the plan was to go terribly wrong. The top German official not only crash-landed his aircraft miles from the rendezvous, he turned out to be none other than Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess. The capture of Hitler's second-in-command couldn't be kept secret. George was rushed from the scene. The talks were shelved. Once again, George had been denied the opportunity of making his mark. But he was to make one final bid to prove himself. On the 26th of August, 1942, George set out for Iceland on a secret assignment. The official story is that he was on a routine flight to inspect military bases. But in London, some days earlier, George had secretly met with a top American general who'd offered him the prospect of a significant role in the war effort. George was to become a key liaison officer between the British and American forces as they planned for the invasion of Nazi Europe. Now he was on his way to a top-level meeting to confirm his position. But inexplicably, George's seaplane departed from the flight plan. Instead of staying over the sea, it turned inland and headed towards high ground. In dense fog, the aircraft slammed into a Scottish hillside and exploded. George's body was later pulled from the wreckage. He was 39 years old. As for the causes of the crash, to this day they remain a mystery. Rumors persist that George himself was at the controls.
Those who are in the know what happened. They just don't choose to share it with the rest of us. The Public Record Office at Kew, the Royal Library at Windsor, anywhere you go, the files have been sifted, material has been taken out. We are not allowed to know what happened. Why?
George's body was brought to London and laid to rest in the family plot at Windsor Castle. He left a heartbroken wife and 3 young children. Amongst the mourners, George's longtime friend, Noel Coward.
I talked to him on Sunday, and now suddenly I shall never see him again. I can hardly believe it. But of course that is nonsense. It is never difficult to believe that someone young and kind and charming is dead. When the coffin passed with George's cap on it, I was finished. I gave up all pretense and just stood with the tears splashing down my face.
There was this terribly sad thing that Queen Mary wrote, saying, he used to say I looked nice and he was the only person that ever said that. Somehow when I read that, it really touched me, because what a little thing to say to a mother, oh, you're looking nice today. And yet that had somehow meant something completely out of proportion to her.
Prince George was the royal with taste. He knew what he liked, and that was really unusual in a royal family where there was quite a restricting, stuffy sense of the past guiding the present. There was an elegance and a sort of stylishness about the man which set him above the rest of the royal family.
He was just an extremely glamorous member of the family who made an extremely glamorous marriage, and he went out like a light when he shouldn't have done.
Tomorrow at 9, exploring a relationship that put crucial cracks in the House of Windsor. Prince Andrew, the Fergie years. Next tonight on 4, a hostage situation gets personal for a hard-nosed kidnap ransom specialist. Russell Crowe and Meg Ryan star in Proof of Life.